That check comes from my roof, my food, my rules. Every dollar you earn belongs to this family. You don't get to decide what that means. I was 23 years old and standing in the kitchen of the house I'd grown up in, holding a pay stub from my first real nursing job, and my stepfather was already folding it into his shirt pocket before I could even read the total. His name was Gerald. That's what I called him, Gerald. Never Dad, not once in the 9 years since my mother married him. He had wide hands and a voice that didn't need to get loud to make you feel small. Most people in Barrie thought he was charming. He coached minor hockey on weekends. He brought Tim Hortons to the neighbours when their pipes burst in February. He was the kind of man who made sure everyone within a 10-kilometre radius knew exactly what kind of man he was. Behind our front door, he was someone else entirely. My mother. I'll call her what I called her. Mom. She wasn't a cruel person. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the rest of this. She was afraid. She had been afraid since before I understood what fear looked like in an adult's face. She had that particular stillness that women develop when they've learned that the wrong expression at the wrong moment costs something. I recognized it later when I was doing clinical rotations in the ER, and I saw it on patients who came in with injuries that didn't quite match their explanations. I recognized it because I had watched my mother perfect it across my entire adolescence. My father died when I was 11. A cardiac event, they said, which is the clinical way of saying his heart simply stopped one Tuesday morning while he was scraping ice off the windshield of his truck in our driveway in Barrie. He was 44. He had a thermos of coffee on the hood and a hockey bag in the back seat, and he was supposed to drive me to practice at 7. I found him when I came outside with my skates. Gerald arrived about 2 years later. Mom met him through a mutual friend, a church acquaintance, someone who thought she needed help, and maybe she did. She had a mortgage and a grief that had gone mostly unprocessed and a daughter who was starting to need more than she had capacity to give. Gerald presented himself as capable. He was, in the practical sense. He fixed the deck. He understood the oil furnace. He negotiated the refinancing on the house and came home proud, like he'd slain something. What he didn't tell us, not until the paperwork was already signed and the ring was already on my mother's hand, was that he had very specific ideas about how money moved in a household. His money. Everybody's money. The same thing. In his mind. By the time I was in nursing school at Georgian College, I was working weekend shifts at a grocery store, and Gerald was collecting half my paycheck. He called it rent. He called it contribution. He called it learning the value of things. I called it nothing, because I had learned early that naming it out loud cost more than the silence did. I graduated in June. I got a position at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, full-time with benefits. I was proud in a way I had never been proud before. A clean, uncomplicated pride, the kind that belongs only to you. I remember sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot on my first real day, just sitting there with my ID badge in my hand, thinking, this is mine. This is something he cannot touch. I was wrong about that. The conversation in the kitchen happened on the third Friday after my first paycheck. Gerald had been waiting. I know that now. He had been calculating, the way he calculated everything, letting me feel the ground under my feet before he reminded me it belonged to him. He explained with great patience that I was living in his house, that the cost of living in his house was now going to reflect my new income, that he had run the numbers and determined that $1,200 a month was fair. He said this with the same tone he used to explain hockey positions to 7-year-olds. Clear. Instructional, final, $1,200. In 2019, a one-bedroom in Barrie ran about $1,400. He knew that. He had made it just cheap enough that leaving seemed irrational and just expensive enough that saving was impossible. I understand now that this was precise, that it had been thought through. I said nothing in the kitchen. I said nothing for 4 more months. What changed wasn't courage exactly. It was a phone call. I have an aunt, my father's younger sister, who lives in Guelph. She and my mother had a falling out years before Gerald, something small that had calcified into distance the way small things do in families. She called me in October out of nowhere because she had heard through my grandmother that I'd graduated and she wanted to say congratulations. We hadn't spoken in almost 5 years. We talked for an hour, and at the end, because she asked how things were and because I was tired in a way that had gotten into my bones, I told her a fraction of it. Not the checks, just the atmosphere, the way the house felt, the way my mother never quite looked at me anymore. My aunt was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sweetheart, what you're describing has a name." She sent me information, links, a number for a resource line in Ontario. She didn't push. She just made sure I had the tools, and then she let me decide what to do with them. I decided to leave. I gave myself a deadline, 60 days to save enough the first and last on a place in town. I opened a second bank account that Gerald didn't know about at a different institution, and I had a portion of my direct deposit routed there. $40 here, $60 there. The amounts had to be small enough that he wouldn't notice when he reviewed the household finances. And he did review them, monthly, with a printed spreadsheet and a red pen. I was 51 days in when he found the statements. I don't know how. I was careful. I thought I was careful. But Gerald had a way of knowing things, a way of moving through spaces without announcing himself. And one evening in late November, he came into my room while I was on a night shift. Came in, went through my desk. And when I came home at 7 in the morning, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the statements in front of him and his hands flat on the surface, very still, the way things get still before they aren't. My mother was standing at the counter. She was holding a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. What happened next took about 4 minutes. I know because I counted, afterward, the way you count things when you're trying to make sense of time. He spoke first. He used words like betrayal and ungrateful and the audacity. That was one of his words, audacity. And then he stood up, and the chair went back and I stepped back too, toward the hallway, because I had learned what it meant when he stood up like that. And then he crossed the kitchen, and he grabbed my wrist, and I pulled away, and I was almost at the front door when the sound happened. I had never heard a sound like that before. I had treated patients who had been in explosions. I understood intellectually that the body registers a gunshot differently than the ears do. But nothing prepares you for the feeling of it. The specific, horrible wrongness of something passing through the air beside your shoulder. Close enough that I felt the displacement, and then the door frame splintering 2 inches from my face. I ran. I was in socks on an icy November driveway in Barrie, Ontario at 7:15 in the morning, and I ran. I don't remember making the decision to run south toward the park by Kempenfelt Bay. I think I just ran in the direction that was away, and that happened to be south. The cold was immediate and total. The kind of cold that gets under your scrubs within 30 seconds and starts to make your thoughts slow. I was shaking before I reached the end of the block. Not from cold. From the specific, clarifying terror of having just been shot at by a man who was still in that house with my mother. The park was empty at that hour except for a man sitting on a bench near the water. He was older, late 60s I guessed, maybe 70, wearing a good coat, the kind that meant he wasn't out there by accident or necessity. He had a thermos beside him, and he was watching the bay. There was a small white device on the table beside him, a tablet of some kind, screen on. I must have made a sound when I got close. Or maybe I didn't, and he simply felt the bench shift when I collapsed onto the other end of it. Either way, he turned, and when he saw me, the scrubs, the socks, the shaking, the way I was holding my own shoulder even though nothing had hit me, just because my body needed to hold something, his expression changed completely. He was not alarmed in the way that most people are alarmed, which is to say he did not pull back or look around for help or take out his phone. He simply looked at me with the full weight of his attention and waited. I realized he was making no sound, not a word, not a murmur. He was just watching my face. I don't know what made me do it. I work with patients from all kinds of backgrounds. I've had some basic ASL training through the hospital, the kind they offer staff as a continuing education module, and I had always taken it seriously because communication is the job. So I signed, roughly, imperfectly, but I signed the word for help. Just that. Help. His face opened up. He reached immediately for the tablet, typed something, and turned it toward me. The text-to-speech read, "Are you hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" He was deaf. Profoundly deaf, I learned later. Had been since his mid-40s after a long illness that had taken his hearing in stages. He had learned to read faces and spaces the way other people learn languages, completely, fluently, with an ear for things that had nothing to do with sound. I typed back. My hands were shaking, but I typed. I told him there had been a gun. I told him I worked at the hospital and I lived 8 blocks from where we were sitting and I could not go back. I told him my mother was still in that house. He read what I had written and he was still for a moment. Then he typed, "My name is Walter. I'm going to make a call. Stay here." He stepped a few feet away, not out of earshot, I realized, but out of my eye line, to give me a moment, and he made a call on his phone, the old-fashioned kind, because he had software that transcribed in real time for him. I watched him stand very straight while he spoke, one hand in his coat pocket, looking out over the bay. He spoke for perhaps 3 minutes. When he came back, he typed, "Police are on their way. Do you want me to stay with you until they arrive?" I nodded. He stayed. The officers arrived in 2 vehicles, a cruiser from South Simcoe and a second car whose occupants wore plain clothes. Gerald was arrested at the house 40 minutes later. My mother was brought to the hospital, not because she was physically injured, but because the responding officers had specific training for these situations, and they recognized what I was starting to name properly in my own mind. I gave my statement in the ER waiting room, which was strange, giving a statement in a place I had only ever occupied professionally. Walter stayed until I had family present. My aunt, who drove up from Guelph in under an hour when I called, who walked in and put both arms around me in the entrance of the ER and didn't say anything for a long moment, which was exactly right. Before he left, Walter pressed a card into my hand. It was a plain card, cream-coloured, with a name and a phone number. No title. I looked at the name and then I looked at him and he smiled slightly, the kind of smile that knows something and isn't making a production of it, and he signed, slowly, clearly, the sign for OK, just checking. I looked the name up that evening from my aunt's spare room in Guelph, wrapped in a borrowed sweater with a cup of chamomile I wasn't tasting, and I understood. Walter, the man on the bench with the thermos and the tablet, was a retired Lieutenant General of the Canadian Armed Forces. He had served for over 3 decades. He had commanded operations I couldn't fully understand from the Wikipedia summary. He had also, in retirement, become a significant figure in deaf advocacy in Ontario and had sat on the board of 3 provincial justice-adjacent organisations, one of which had direct relationships with the Office of the Attorney General. The name on the card meant something to the people who received his calls. The call he had made from the bench at Kempenfelt Bay had not simply dispatched a patrol car. It had flagged the case in a way that meant it would be properly handled. Gerald was charged with discharging a firearm with intent to wound, break and enter of my personal spaces and financial abuse under the framework of coercive control that Ontario had been strengthening since 2021. The Crown pursued it. They pursued it because the documentation was solid, because I had records. The bank statements he had found became evidence, not liability, and because someone had made sure, quietly, that the right people were paying attention. My mother did not testify against him. I need to say that plainly without bitterness because I've spent a long time sitting with it, and I've arrived somewhere more complicated than anger. She had lived inside that dynamic for 9 years. What he had done to her was more thorough and more long-term than what he had done to me. She was not protecting him when she stayed silent. She was protecting the only self she had managed to keep intact. I understand that now. It took me a long time to understand it, and I'm not sure I would have without the counselling my workplace benefits covered. Good. unhurried counseling with a therapist in Guelph who had a cactus on her windowsill and a way of letting silence do the work. Gerald was convicted the following spring. 14 months after the morning in the park, he sat in a courtroom in Barrie, and a judge read a sentence that included the word custody and a number of years and a prohibition on firearms. I sat in the gallery with my aunt on one side and a victim services worker on the other, and when the sentence was read, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, something quieter. Something more like the specific relief of a sound stopping that you'd gotten so used to you'd forgotten it was there. My mother called me 2 weeks after sentencing. She had moved out of the house that had been refinanced in Gerald's name, which the court had ordered be assessed as part of the financial remedy proceeding. She was staying with her sister in Penetang. She had started talking to someone. She said she didn't know how to apologize for the length of time that it needed to cover, and I told her she didn't need to find those words yet. That we had time. I meant it. I still mean it. We're not where we were before, Gerald, and I don't think we'll be exactly that again. But we have Sunday phone calls now. She asks about my patients in the general way that you ask about someone's work, and I ask about her garden because she started a container garden on her sister's balcony, tomatoes and herbs, which is something she used to do before everything. It's small. It counts. I'm still at the hospital. I was promoted to charge nurse last year on our unit, which came with a raise and a different kind of tired, the kind I actually like. I have a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Barrie, 12 minutes from work, with a parking spot that is entirely mine and a lease that has only my name on it. The first month I paid my own rent, $1,520, which is what one-bedrooms were running by then. I sat with the e-transfer confirmation on my phone for probably longer than was normal, and then I put it down and made dinner. Walter and I have stayed in touch. We have coffee twice a year at a place on Dunlop Street where the tables are near a window so he can see the light clearly, and we talk, him on his tablet and me with my clumsy signing getting gradually less clumsy, about his advocacy work and my unit, and occasionally the bay, which is visible on clear days from the hill at the end of his street. He doesn't want recognition for what he did. He said that plainly. He was a man on a bench who had a phone and knew the right people and recognized a person in trouble. I think about what would have happened if I had run north instead of south that morning, if he hadn't been on that bench, if I hadn't taken the ASL module seriously, if he hadn't turned at exactly that moment. I don't think it serves me to pull at those threads. What I know is that I ran toward the water and found someone who met me at the edge of it, and that everything that came after came from that. The rest is just gratitude, the quiet, unperformable kind, the kind you carry in your chest on ordinary Tuesdays when you're scraping ice off your windshield and you're late for a shift and it's cold and it's February in Ontario, and you are, against all previous evidence, exactly where you are supposed to be. I used to think that what happened to me on that driveway in November was just luck, wrong place, wrong time, then somehow right place, right time, a coin flip. Fate, if you want to call it that, though I've never been entirely comfortable with that word. But the longer I sit with it, and I have sat with it, in therapy, in quiet drives home from night shifts, in the particular stillness of a one-bedroom apartment that belongs only to me, the more I think it wasn't luck at all. It was the sum of 100 small choices that I had made, and that Gerald had made, and that my mother had made, and that Walter had made, long before we all ended up at that park by the water. Gerald made choices too. He chose, every single time, to reach for control instead of connection. He chose to treat the people closest to him as resources to be managed, rather than people to be known. And those choices accumulated. They compounded. Not in some mystical, cosmic way, just in the plain, ordinary way that cruelty always does. It leaves evidence. It creates records. It produces the kind of documented pattern that a Crown prosecutor can stand up in court and read aloud. Gerald didn't end up convicted because the universe punished him. He ended up convicted because he had spent 9 years making provable decisions, and eventually, someone with the right connections made sure those decisions were seen clearly. Walter made choices too, across an entirely different lifetime. He had spent decades in a profession that demands that you show up when it's hard, that you keep your word when it costs you, that you do the right thing in the moment even when no one is watching, and the cold is coming off Georgian Bay and you're just an old man sitting with a thermos at 7 in the morning. He had built, brick by brick, a kind of integrity that meant when he made a phone call from that bench, people listened. That didn't happen by accident. That was a life's worth of decisions about who he wanted to be, and I made choices. Small, frightened, imperfect choices. I took the ASL module at the hospital because I thought communication was worth learning properly. I opened a second bank account because I was tired enough to be brave. I ran toward the water instead of somewhere else. None of those choices felt significant at the time. They felt like barely surviving, but they were mine and they mattered. What I carry from all of this isn't a lesson I could hand to someone else in a tidy sentence. It's more like a posture, a way of moving through things. I think about Gerald and I understand now that the absence of basic decency of treating people as people is not a neutral thing. It costs you eventually in exact proportion to the harm it caused. I think about Walter and I understand that the ability to truly see another person, to stay calm and reach toward them without needing anything back, is a skill that has to be built over years. And I think about myself, the version of me in socks on an icy driveway, shaking and running, and I understand that courage isn't what you feel, it's what you do with your legs when your feelings have stopped working. I'm still building. The apartment, the promotion, the Sunday calls with my mother, the twice-yearly coffees with Walter, where my signing gets a little less clumsy each time. It's not a dramatic life. Most of it looks like ordinary Tuesdays. But ordinary Tuesdays, I've learned, are the whole point.